So good afternoon, you all. Shiri and I are from Google, from the Privacy and Trust Response team. We'll be talking to you about privacy for all. That's designing privacy for different kinds of users based on different needs, different capabilities, and different user characteristics. So today we're going to first start with defining what inclusive privacy means. It might mean different things for different people. So we're going to set the baseline in terms of what we mean by inclusive privacy. And then after that, we are going to break the talk into two different sections. First, proactive approaches. How can you look at inclusive privacy with proactive lens? And then secondly, because we are from the response team, which is the incident management team, the second aspect will be the reactive approaches. So first, what does inclusive privacy mean? So just stepping back, looking at privacy, it's a fundamental human right, and it centers around people's interests in having control regarding what other people can see or know about them, but also regarding their own assets. And inclusive privacy is sort of like coming in addition to that human right for people to control what they want people to know about them and about their assets, to say there are various contexts for different users. And different users might face different privacy risks depending on their individual context. So inclusive privacy is an approach to privacy design that takes into account the different user needs, regardless of their abilities, characteristics, identities, or values. So it's a slight shift from traditional privacy that looks at an average user, where we are designing products for an average. We just say, here's our user, and these are the privacy considerations we're taking into account. A good example for you to think about is a refugee. So consider a refugee who is migrating from their own country into a different country for safety reasons. And they might want to start afresh with their life. So they go online, they change their name in the different accounts on different platforms, with the idea that nobody is going to be able to trace them or to find them. But if a platform still maintains or matches your name when somebody searches for you on the platform, either because they're maintaining your name as part of the domain or as part of the user ID, then it means this particular user, this particular refugee is not going to have the privacy that they wanted. So they are still at risk of being surveyed and tracked. Now, when you think of inclusive privacy, there are different aspects that you need to take into account. The core aspects include age, gender, sexual orientation, culture, religion, ethnicity, disability, socioeconomic status, geographical and global relevance, just to name a few. There are multiple factors that might present or pose different risks or unique risks to a user. Now, just shifting now to how we can think about this in the context of designing products proactively. We are looking at it with four different aspects. The first aspect is first knowing what dimensions of diversity apply to your context. So you have a product concept, you know what the product needs to do, you know your target audience for that product. Now, how do you go about identifying or understanding what diversity aspects you need to take into account as you're designing privacy features? So at first, I talked about those different aspects like gender, sexual orientation, geographical location. Those are the different aspects that might come into play. But for your specific product, when you know which users you're targeting, where you want to launch your product, the gender or the target age group for your product, that's going to guide you into understanding what aspects you need to take into account. So it's important for you to understand the different ways in which diversity can actually impact privacy in the design of your privacy features and processes. Now, once you know maybe the geographical location is going to be a critical factor for your product, you have different age groups, you have people of different cultures that are going to be using your product. Then you move on to identify marginalized groups. When we say marginalized groups, these are groups of people that have been historically disadvantaged or excluded from different design aspects or from the society. And they are at risk of facing disproportionate risks compared to the average user. So I gave the example of the refugee. And these people are more likely to be targeted or to have their privacy violated in most cases. So it's important for you, once you have identified the critical aspects, to say we need to consider the geographical aspects, because maybe we are launching a product, say, in Mali, we are launching a product in Pakistan. What values or aspects of that context do you need to take into consideration when you are thinking about your privacy features? Now, thirdly, you move on to assessing the risks, the privacy risks in the specific context that you are launching your product. So you have identified the diversity or inclusive aspects. You have identified your marginalized groups. Now you need to understand what privacy risks do these people face in the specific context in which they're going to use the product. Now that means you're actually considering a convergence of different factors. You're looking at the inclusive factors, you're looking at the marginalized groups, you are then looking at their individual needs in each context for you to be able to reason or think through the privacy risks. So, because there are times when a combination of these factors might pose unique risks. For example, a transgender woman in Uganda is going to face different risks from a cisgender woman in the same context. Why? Because their culture does not recognize or it outlaws transgender people. So that person belongs to a marginalized group, the transgenders. So when you're designing privacy controls, you need to think through what is it that can put this user at risk. It might be, for example, revealing or disclosing gender, somebody's gender, based on what they have uploaded in a particular platform. It might be people change names. Maybe they don't want to be identified with a previous gender, so they have changed their name, because you can easily infer gender based on the name. Is it a masculine name or is it a feminine name? Now, if you're just disclosing those names, somebody has changed their name, we are still able to match those, it's going to actually foretell or disclose the gender of this person. So when you're assessing privacy risks, you are combining these different aspects, the marginalized groups, what are the different inclusive factors, and then you're thinking through the needs of these individual users. The final piece to it, you need to then design the actual features once you have understood the risks that these marginalized people face. How do you go about doing it? There are different ways. You can use inclusive design approaches where you involve the individual users or the users from these different groups or locations to make sure that whatever controls or features you're designing are usable to these for these target groups. So examples would be maybe using participatory design approaches, doing code design sessions with the individual users, or doing community-led practices. The core aspect or the critical aspect to this is you need to respect, support, and learn from these marginalized groups. If you don't, you'll miss it. You might think you have designed features that work for these people, but they don't. And then finally, it's important to actually test your features to make sure that they're actually working in these particular locations. Let's not assume. Let's go in and collect real data that actually confirms that the thing or whatever we have designed works in those particular locations. I'll then pass on to Shri to actually talk about the reactive approaches.
So now that we've looked at some inflection points where diverse perspectives can be integrated into the privacy design and the software development processes, let's now move on to discuss how we can actually react to these privacy issues when the product does not actually meet user expectations. So well, we can react and respond only if we are able to detect these issues. So let's look at some detection mechanisms. So while it would be very beneficial to derive all the inclusive privacy design patterns and anti-patterns that can be applied universally to all products, practically this is challenging to account for all possible dimensions of diversity. So taking a more risk-based approach and generalizing to a reasonable number of dimensions of diversity can be effective. And as we identify more risk profiles based on user research and feedback, this can be improved iteratively. Some companies also benefit from having an inclusive privacy toolkit, and that typically includes like a design checklist, having a threat model to identify various attack surfaces and threat vectors for their products and services. And also merging your traditional privacy impact assessments with inclusive privacy assessments can help us approach these reviews in a more holistic manner. And most companies also have an intake process for users to report their privacy concerns and provide their feedback. So having the right inclusive champions review these issues pertinent to inclusion and then review user feedback can help establish that feedback loop between the development process and actually receiving the user feedback. And where your products use ML models, so companies should ideally test for algorithmic bias. Now, for us to respond effectively to all these privacy issues, we need cross-functional commitment to inclusive privacy. So oftentimes, due to lack of clear ownership, resources, or leadership support, these issues can get deprioritized. So the commitment needs to be both top-down and bottom-up. So establishing a clear inclusive privacy design includes like having a good vision, strategy, and transparent privacy policies which are communicated to all the employees, and that really helps set the tone at the top. Now, designing and implementing a privacy governance framework which accounts for inclusion, meaning you have an inclusive product development team, you have design, marketing, engineering, legal, all of these teams need to work together to create these inclusive and privacy protective products and services. Now, as for governance in large organizations, there can be a dedicated team of inclusive privacy champions for different products, or like for each product or like a group of products. But for smaller organizations, there could be one team of inclusive privacy champions with representatives from like various functions like legal, marketing, engineering, design, and product. So all in all, the commitment to achieving inclusive privacy should be shared across the organization and be baked into the organizational values, rather than having one team which is just siloed in one corner of the organization. So after we actually secure the commitment that we need a framework to actually prioritize these different concerns that we're receiving. So some of the attributes to consider when you're actually designing a framework would be, how can we assign the priority or the severity or of the privacy issue, or how can we, would it be based on scope, would it be based on impact, the likelihood of abuse, and who would ideally be accountable and responsible for the fix, like who would perform a variant analysis, and how should we treat these bugs, or should we treat them as incidents, and so on. So in conclusion, we all know that we don't have dedicated privacy standards for inclusive privacy design. So having an increased collaboration among various stakeholders that can foster the development of better inclusive privacy policies, industry standards, which actually prioritize inclusivity, promote the digital rights, and address the privacy gaps effectively can be really helpful. And as you know, there is no silver bullet. We don't have one magical tool to identify all these different gaps for inclusion. But a good place for organizations to really start would be investing in user research, like inclusive research, encouraging diversity within your internal teams first, so that you can actually foster that kind of innovation, and actually integrating inclusion into your product testing programs. So with that, I think we're out of time. So I will pause and we can take questions.